Some pretty enormous Warhammer 40k rules reveals today. Let's talk through Games Workshop's latest battle report and all of the stats that we can work out for the Tyranids and Space Marines within. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where it seems that this week will be battle report week for 40k 10th edition. We'd already had confirmed that some great big 2,000 point games of Warhammer 40k will be happening in the next couple of days, I believe being streamed over on Twitch. Today we've got a rather interesting battle report version over from Warhammer Plus that gives us a whole load of stats for the Tyranid units and a few rather interesting preview rules for the Combat Patrol game mode in general. The news that we've got today I think is some fairly decent previews, particularly for Tyranid units. All of this comes from the Games Workshop Battle Report episode that just dropped. You can watch it over on Warhammer Plus, and it's basically a Combat Patrol game mode of Tyranids versus Space Marines out of the Combat Patrols that are built from the Leviathan box. As I'm sure most of you will know, Combat Patrol is a bit different in 40k 10th edition. It's literally just playing a box set versus a box set most of the time. No options for choice of war gear, and a few rules will be changed between the primary rules of Combat Patrol and 10th edition 40k, as they're actually going to need to change rules to balance the boxes, as opposed to having points and things, as of course you play with set models. Having said that though, at least from this battle report, it doesn't appear that any major rules have been changed with what we know from the main datasheets of Warhammer 40k. All the Space Marines that were attacking in this episode had the exact same stats in terms of defense and damage. There were just a few minor things that look like they've had balance changes for Combat Patrol, particularly the Space Marines' Oath of Moments. My guess is that for most armies, they'll probably be trying to keep the actual rules changes into supporting things like stratagems, secondaries, and the faction rule, and actually where they can keep the stat lines for the models consistent between Combat Patrol and main 40k, as otherwise you're just going to cause a whole bunch of confusion if people learn one stat line but not another. Overall, the battle report I thought was fairly good fun. Perhaps my favourite touch was this little Space Marine modelled on an impaled Tyranid bit of vegetation there, kind of harking back to that rather creepy dead Space Marine that was in the launch trailer. I feel like they're perhaps a little bit over the top with a slightly manufactured enthusiasm, but I thought the battle report was quite a fun one, fairly close, and a good outing for the Space Marines and the Tyranids. I'd bear in mind that as with previous for this is a Warhammer Plus Battle Report, and there is the chance there could be errors in it. Last time we had a demo game like this, there were a few rather big technical errors when they previewed the Arcs of Omen rule set. In particular, they implied that deployment, setup and first turn all worked very differently from how they did, so I maybe wouldn't read too much into game setup. I feel like they might just do that a little bit differently for the camera. What it is good for though is the raw stats of the models, the rough gist of how you play Combat Patrol, and in particular really big previews for all the Tyranid units that we haven't seen yet. In terms of the armies used, the Space Marines were the Combat Patrol for Strike Force Octavius, and the Tyranids were the Vardengeist Swarm. These have been previewed on Warhammer Community already, and are basically the Combat Patrols that you can build out of Leviathan if you want to. The Space Marines have got some Infernus Marines, Terminators, and the Terminator Captain and Librarian. The Tyranids have got the Tyranid Prime, 2 units of Termagants, the Von Rhines Leapers, Barbgaunts, and the Psychophage. I kind of wonder if these sets might be in some way representative of the starter sets that follow up Leviathan. I guess we'll see what happens on that front. In terms of model value wise though, the Tyranids certainly look like they've got a lot more value in their side of it than the Space Marines. The points might be kind of similar, but Games Workshop would certainly sell the models on the right for far more than the models on the left when they come out in individual plastic kits. It's going to be interesting to see what sort of follow-up release they get. For the mission that they were playing a Combat Patrol mission that is apparently from the core book. So far we've had the full core rules leaks, but we haven't had the auxiliary sections, things like the Combat Patrol section or the Crusade section yet. Apparently this is one of the Combat Patrol missions from the core book, and it's basically one where you fight over 4 objectives in the midfield. The scoring appears to be 5 victory points per objective held at the end of your command phase, plus the faction secondary, which for Combat Patrol can be chosen for each faction. In this one, just for the example, they went for the ones for killing things with their warlords. In Combat Patrol, battle line units get that sticky objectives type rule, so basically if you held it in your command phase and the opponent doesn't take it back, the objective remains yours even if you have no models on that objective. That was relevant in the game when they lost some Termagants. I guess it's kind of a big deal when you don't have all that many units on the map. This mission's got a bonus special rule called Retrieve Intelligence. This one's one to farm another command point if you happen to hold an objective, and you have to recover the intelligence from each objective once. You can't repeatedly do it on one objective, so it's basically a little way to get some more resources throughout the game. Feels a little bit similar to actions that we've had in previous games, but they seem to be gone from 40k 10th. Finally, one of the big questions is whether or not you can bring in deep strikers on turn 1. There's nothing in the core rules that forbid it, but there's a very good chance it crops up in the mission rules. In this mission, they brought their Terminators on turn 2, but they didn't explicitly say that they couldn't have brought them on turn 1, so I guess that question's still up in the air. I'd say perhaps the biggest news out of the preview game were all the stats on the new Tyranids that we've got. All the Space Marine units that they played with have basically already had their datasheets revealed, so it wasn't so interesting there. But we've basically got pretty much the full stat lines and abilities for things like the Psychophage, Von Leapers, and some extra things for the Barbgaunts and Winged Prime too. I feel like a lot of Tyranid players are quite interested to find out what these do. First up, we've got the Psychophage, and that's got a toughness 9 with a 3+ save. I didn't catch exactly how many wounds that it has, but I feel like it's going to be kind of similar to that Screamer Killer, somewhere around 10ish. If you manage to count up the exact number during the battle report, feel free to let us know down in the comments. It also does appear to have a fairly solid 5+ feel no pain against all attacks that come in, not just psychic. That's another pretty hefty damage boost, basically gives you an extra 50% worth of durability compared with what it would have normally had. For weapons, it basically makes attacks with a whole bunch of Strength 6 AP1 stuff. It appears to have a shooting phase attack called Psychoclastic Torrents. This one's basically a fairly beefy Strength 6 AP-1 flamer at 12 inches. It gets Ignores Cover and the Torrent special rule, so it's going to be pretty brutal with clearing through infantry. Then when it makes combat, it attacks with Talons and a Betentacled Maw. D6+1 attacks hitting on a weapon skill of 3+, Strength 6 AP-1 and Damage 2, a pretty decent profile for chewing through Space Marines. This one's lore is that it's particularly good against Psychers, so it gets the Anti-Psyker 4+ rule and Devastating Wounds, meaning that 6s will normally deal 2 mortal wounds instead of damage and the opponent won't be able to make saves, and if you're against Psychers it always wounds on a 4, and any of those wounds will be 2 mortal wounds instead of damage. I must admit, I did find it kind of hilarious that the Marine player decided to charge this with a solo injured Librarian. I guess it was probably just to showcase its ability for the battle report, but it was kind of funny just how monumentally a bad idea that would be. Finally, it looks like its datasheet special rule is called Feeding Frenzy. This one gets a +1 to hit if the unit that it's targeting is below starting strength, so I guess if it's fighting a squad that's lost a model, and then it gets a +1 to wound as well if the unit it's targeting is below half strength. So say if it's a single model that's lost over half its wounds, or a squad that's lost over half its models. I guess that's not a bad rule to have if you maybe manage to chip down an enemy infantry or 2 with that Cyclastic Torrent attack, and then you aim to finish them off in melee, hopefully hitting on 2s, maybe even wounding on +1 as well if you're lucky. Overall, it looks like a beast that's fairly dedicated at killing infantry, isn't going to be punching up too hard against hard targets. Next up, and I think with a fairly interesting profile for the early game, are the Von Leapers. These guys come in a squad of 3 in the Leviathan box. I think there's a reasonable chance that you might be able to double up on the squads to a max of 6 when we get the full datasheets, though I feel like with infiltrating things you often want to keep them in small units anyway. Stats wise, in their couple of fights we got a fairly good idea of their damage and defense. When they jump on you in combat, they get 6 attacks each, with weapon skill 3+, strength 5, AP-1 and damage 1. That's seriously quite a brutal anti-infantry melee profile there. 3 of them should have a very good chance of wiping out a horde infantry unit in a single round of combat. Toughness wise, they seem kind of equivalent to what a Tyranid warrior is in 9th edition 40k. 3 wounds with toughness 5 and a 4+ save. Unlike the warriors though, they aren't a synapse unit, they only get a leadership 8+, so ideally they'd be wanting to try and coordinate with other synaptic units if they want to be avoiding battle shock and test on the 3d6. From the special rules that we saw for them, it looks like they've got a fights first special rule. This one's a lot more powerful than it used to be in 10th edition now. Basically, if the enemy charges into these, you'll get to nominate these guys to strike first before the enemy charges, and then you continue alternating with other fight first units. It means that it's quite good charge defense, unless the opponent charges them with something that can tank a bunch of anti-infantry attacks, they're going to have a bunch of their numbers reduced. As mentioned as well, they also have that Infiltrator special rule. That's the one where they set up in the midfield, greater than 9 inches from enemy models and the enemy deployment zone, and it seems that you roll off with your opponent to set those up, rather than putting them in the normal deployment steps. Overall, I feel like they seem like a pretty interesting unit, provided they're costed cheaply enough. Forward deployment units are often worth having at least 1 of, maybe 2 if you're going a bit heavy on them. Just starting on the midfield objectives as trading pieces and getting the scoring going early has a lot of value. Plus they can potentially screen or do nuisance charges, or even alpha strike enemy infantry depending on the matchup. If they're playing aggressively though, they certainly can get alpha struck first turn, as basically happened in the battle report, where they were set up very early and then the Space Marine Force just got to basically shoot them a lot before they even got to act. Next up, we've got Barbgaunts, which we didn't really get to see the full profile of. As a gunline unit, they weren't incentivized to do much movement, seeing as we already know that their biocannon has the heavy keywords. They're fielded in a squad of 5 from the Leviathan box, and besides the stats that we already knew, we also learnt a tiny bit about their defensive profile and their disruption bombardment. For their biocannon from a previous preview, we know that that's 24 inches, d6 shots hitting on 4s, strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1, with both the blast and heavy keywords. With AP 0 and low strength, it's going to be good against light infantry, but not very good against heavy things. In reality, that disruption bombardment keyword is by far the most valuable thing out of their datasheet. On the defensive, it looks like these guys are 2 wounds apiece, either toughness 4 or toughness 5, based on that assault cannon wounding them on 3s, and they also have a 4+ save. If I'd had to guess based on the models, I would have guessed toughness 4. Again, if anyone spotted them being wounded by storm bolters at all in the video that would tell us one way or the other, feel free to let me know down in the comments and I'll post it as a pinned update. From this preview though, that disruption bombardment looks absolutely brutal against infantry armies. In the battle report they basically confirmed that you can indeed fire it into multiple different infantry units each turn. It isn't just one infantry unit that gets slowed this way. Basically, if you even hit an infantry unit with this thing, then they get -2 to their movement and -2 to advance and charge rolls. That's an enormous massive debuff to enemy units trying to get into combat, 4-inch threat range at the very least, potentially even more if they could advance and charge. I know it was already implied by the rule that they'd shown off, but I am still kind of surprised that they can split it basically 5 different ways from one unit. With d6 shots you're at least odds on to get a hit on each unit that you target. You could basically slow down an entire enemy infantry army with just one unit of Barbgaunts, which really seems excessive utility for just one unit like this. I can't imagine that they're going to be costing a crazy amount of points with that attack profile. And even to potentially just have one unit of these be able to target your forces, this seems like it could be absolutely monstrous against things like foot orcs or Adeptus Custodes or something, having their movement slowed across the board. Definitely looks like an interesting unit, obviously not going to be relevant against some armies though, it won't be relevant against knights where they can't slow them because they're not infantry. Next up, and perhaps the unit that we learned the least about, is the Winged Prime. Durability wise, it looks like he's toughness 5. I believe that it was around about 5 or 6 wounds and maybe a 4+ invul save. They seem to imply that there was an even chance of him living or dying from one dice roll, so that would have meant that he would either be saving on a 4+ due to a 2+ armor or a 4+ invul. In melee, it looks like his Prime Talons get 6 attacks at weapon skill 2+, hitting at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2, so again a profile that's fairly good for tearing apart tactical Space Marines. Looks like he provides synapse via his special rules, though I don't think that we actually got to see any other special rules that he did. Maybe he'll have some sort of leader rule if he winds up leading strikes or something. Finally, beyond the Tyranid stat lines, we've got some interesting teasers as to the combat patrol rules for both Tyranids and Space Marines, at least for these particular combat patrols in the Barbgaunts Swarm or Strike Force Octavius. Games Workshop had given us a few teasers as to these and how they work already. It seems that for each combat patrol you get the choice of 2 different warlord traits to customize your leader, and then 2 different secondary objectives to pick depending on the game, plus 3 custom stratagems and 1 faction special rule which might be altered from mainstream 40k. For the Tyranids rules, it still seems like they get their whole board Shadow in the Warp for 1 turn, probably doing at least somewhat early to try and do some annoying battle shock for Space Marine units. Would be a big deal if they failed one on an objective or something. And then for their Warlord trait and their secondary, they previewed these 2. The Tyranid Prime can net himself 4 victory points if he kills any models that phase. I guess that's more generous than the Space Marine one, seeing as he can only do it in combat. And then they used that Warlord trait that they previewed before for the Tyranids, where they gave the Winged Prime a Psychostatic Veil option. That gives him the Lone Operative ability so he can't be shot from too far away, -1 to hit in melee, and also a 4+ invul save, so I guess that answers the question as to where his saving throw was coming from. It looks like it was the Warlord trait. I'll post a correction on the previous slide. Then it seems in Combat Patrol you each get 3 unique stratagems. They did manage to show off all the ones for the Tyranids and the Space Marines here. The Tyranids have one called Hyper Reactive, which is a -1 to hit for any infantry models. That one can be triggered in the shooting or the fight phase, so that's quite a nice little damage debuff there. The one that was definitely used the most was one called Teeming Broods, which is kind of big. This one allows you to replenish d6 termagants, or if you had a unit wiped out, then you get to return a unit into strategic reserve with 2d6 models left in it. In such a small game mode as Combat Patrol, just replenishing entire units for 1 command point seems auto-include good. Even if they just turn up somewhere backfield and hold a home objective again, that does seem absolutely massive. I really feel that out of these 2 combat patrols, the Tyranids do seem like by far the strongest one, even if Space Marines do have tanky Terminator armor. Using this 3 or 4 times over the course of the game seems like a pretty excellent use of command points. You might give your opponent something like 20 to 30 more gaunts to deal with. Finally, they've got one called Voracious Assault. This one you use in your shooting or fight phase, and you get to re-roll the hit roll provided you're targeting the closest enemy unit. Again, a nice simple damage boost there, probably best on the big things like that Psychophage. Again, hard to go wrong with flat extra damage. I'd guess that these will be slightly altered or tweaked in the mainline Tyranid detachments, so it's probably not worth reading into these too much for mainstream 40k. On the flip side, we have the combat patrol rules for the Space Marine Force. Oath of Moment does seem to be less powerful in this game mode. You get to re-roll hit rolls against your given targets, but not wound rolls. To me, that does seem like a very sensible power decrease, as otherwise you're just going to be annihilating one unit from the table every turn. It's still quite a good buff though. The Space Marine Force does appear to come with the set war gear that actually comes with the Leviathan box. I'm sure Games Workshop will release a multi-part Terminator kit at some point, but the rules for this one do indeed reflect the assault cannon. They did say for certain combat patrols they'd be doing generic weapon profiles that reflects no matter which way you build the model. For the Space Marine rules, they have the Wrath of the Emperor secondary, which is the one that they previewed for killing things with your captain. This time it's just 2 victory points per phase for killing a model with him. I guess that's because he's got his Stormbolter, so has a chance to do it in the shooting phase. And this time they've also previewed the Champion Duelist Warlord trait for Mr. Octavius Terminator Captain. His attacks get the Precision and Lethal Hits abilities, Precision allowing him to target characters out of units, and Lethal Hits allowing him to auto-wound on hit rolls of 6. Precision isn't exactly the most useful against the Tyranids though, as they don't have any leaders in units. Finally, we've got the combat patrol stratagems for Space Marines shown off. They've got that Veteran Instincts one, which allows them to punch up a little bit against vehicles. That was one that they'd shown off before, and allows the Terminators in the fight phase to reroll wound rolls of 1, or if against monsters and vehicles they get to flat reroll the wound roll, making them actually decent anti-tank. Seems handy to keep them playable against some of the combat patrols that have heavier units, as otherwise they're going to be wounding things on 5s in combat. Otherwise, they've got a 1 command point one called Gene-Wrought Resilience. This one appears to be a spiritual successor to Transhuman Physiology. It's a reactive defensive buff in the shooting or the fight phase, and if the opponent's attacks had a greater strength than your toughness, usually wounding you on a 3+ or better, then it gives them a -1 to wounds. Things that wound them on a 2+ would wound them on a 3, or things that wound them on a 3+ would wound them on a 4. A pretty handy toughness boost there. Finally, we've got one called Duty and Honor. This one is basically sticky objectives for the Space Marine units. You use it at the end of your command phase and you nominate an objective marker within your control. That objective marker will continue to remain under your control, even if you don't have any models within range of it. I guess that's a way to balance up the Space Marines versus other combat patrols. They don't have any battle line units, as it appears that the Infernus Marines don't seem to count for that. Overall, they seem interesting enough. I feel like the Tyranids have got the better line share of the stratagems with that respawning Gaunts one. I feel like the Space Marine ones are maybe built around rounding out the force and the things that they lack. Overall though, some pretty interesting previews. Thoroughly recommend going to check out the Battle Report yourself if you want to see some fun dice rolled and the first Battle Report of 10th edition. I'll leave a link to that down in the video description. It does appear to be completely free to watch on YouTube, which is quite a nice move I think. Let me know if you've spotted any other rules and I'll try and update them in a pinned correction comment below, but otherwise I'll be looking forward to checking out more rules that we might see previewed in the next day or two, which will get some more good stuff when we see the Leviathan box in action in their streaming games tomorrow and Friday. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the big prize giveaways each month with a chance to win some model kits. If any of that sounds interesting to you, or you'd just like to help keep these videos coming, the link is in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.